So we come to the fourth of the strange and wonderful things about the Dharma, and I'll just read it to you. Just remembering that the Buddha first talks about the strange and wonderful things about the ocean, and then the strange and wonderful things about the Dharma. And so I'm going to tell you the fourth strange and wonderful thing about the ocean, and followed up by the fourth strange and wonderful thing about the Dharma. So, furthermore, whatever great rivers there are, the Ganges, the Yamuna, the Achiravati, the Sarapu, and the Mahi, on reaching the great ocean, lose their former names and identities and are called just the great ocean. This is the fourth wonderful and marvelous quality of the great ocean. On to the Dharma. Just as whatever great rivers there are, etc., 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 so also those of the four castes, nobles, Brahmins, merchants, and workers, having gone forth from the home to the homeless state, in the Dharma and discipline made known by the Tathagata, abandon their former names and identities and are just called recluses, the followers of the Shatyan sun. This is the fourth wonderful and marvelous quality in this Dharma and discipline. So this, like the last two qualities in my last two talks, is not really about the Dharma, it's about the Sangha. So we should really say, or the Buddha should really have said, if I can correct the Buddha, this is the fourth wonderful and marvelous quality of the Sangha. Yeah. So this is, I must say, this is one of my favorites of the wonderful qualities, mainly because of the imagery of the great rivers. And that's why I've called the talk Rivers Flowing to the Ocean. So the great rivers, and he names them, the Ganges, etc., they lose their former names and identities when they reach the ocean. And it's the same when people of whatever caste in India, and I'm going to talk about that soon, it's the same with them. When they join the Sangha, they lose, they shed, as it were, their former identity and perhaps even their name. And in the Buddha's day, the Buddha didn't give them a name, a new name, when they ordained into the monastic order. But since then, it's become a convention, I think, for most Buddhist orders. When one gets ordained, you get a new name. And the reason for that is because you're leaving behind your old identity and you're becoming a member of the Sangha, which is quite different. So you're shedding your past affiliations and you're joining the great ocean. So I really, really like that. And so I'll talk a bit about that later. So this talk is in three parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about the caste system in India, what it is, what the Buddha thought about it, and then Sangharakshita's connection with the caste system and our brothers and sisters in India. I'll talk about that for a little while, but we don't want to talk about India all evening. So then after that, I'm going to talk about what's the relevance of this to us. I'll talk about that for a while. And then we're going to take off into a completely different dimension, hopefully. That's the plan. So the rivers, when they join the great ocean, they lose their name and their identity. Or you could say their fixed identity. Because, you know, it's quite interesting with rivers, isn't it? Because you go to a river, and as the great ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus pointed out, you can't step into the same river twice, because a river is a body of water which is flowing past. So you step in it once and you go back out, and then you step in it again. It was a different body of water. The body of water that you stepped in a while ago is way down there now. And so it's a new body of water. So you can't step into the same river twice. And then hundreds of years later, an English philosopher called A.N. Whitehead said, actually, you can't even step in the same river once. I'll leave you to work that out. So I love this, that when the rivers join the ocean, they lose their name and their identity, because, you know, let's say you're the river mouth, the Thames, you're there, and you can see the river flowing into the ocean. When does the river become ocean? At what point does it lose its name and identity? That's quite an interesting one too. You can reflect on that later. But first of all, I need to talk about the caste system, because what the Buddha said is that just like the great ocean, like the rivers, when they join the ocean, they lose their name and identity. Similarly, when somebody joins the Sangha, the monastic Sangha, they lose their caste, or they don't lose it, they go beyond their caste. They no longer are a member of any particular caste. So you probably know a little bit about the caste system, but I'll just rehearse it a little bit for you. There are four main castes, or there were four main castes. It's been outlawed now, the caste system, but of course it still goes on because habits die hard. So at the moment, the top one is the Brahmins. They're the highest caste. But the first two, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, they were always vying for the top. So in this list that the Buddha gives, he mentions the Kshatriyas first and the Brahmins second, but it's often the other way around. I think in the long term, the Brahmins won. But the Brahmins are like the holy men. They're like the clergy of India, if you like. They're the priests, the scholars, and the teachers. The Kshatriya means warrior, but the Kshatriyas were the rulers, like the kings, and the administrative people. They were the people who kind of looked after, you couldn't say the country, but they looked after areas, because India wasn't always one big country, of course. Third one down is the Vaishyas, and they are the merchants or the agriculturalists. And the fourth one is Shudras, and they are the laborers, the servants, the service providers, and so on. So the Buddha only mentions four castes, and all these castes are subdivided into thousands and thousands of subdivisions, which I'm not going to go into. But there's one that he missed out, and I'm not sure if perhaps it didn't exist in the Buddha's day. I think if it had existed, he would have said something, actually. But this is the Dalits. Now, Dalit means broken, and often they're translated as outcasts. So this fifth, as it were, caste, you can't really call it a caste because they don't have a caste. They're so low in the system that they don't have a caste, they're casteless. And they're often known as the untouchables. Why are they untouchables? It's to do with the Indian ideas about purity. So if you were an untouchable, you're untouchable because if a Brahmin, say, touched you, that would make him impure, and he'd have to go and wash and ritually cleanse himself and so on. They're even subcastes of the untouchables are the unseeables. Even if you saw one, you become impure, so then you'd have to go and ritually wash and so on. So it's you can imagine for people right down the bottom there, it's a terrible, terrible system, really awful. And they're very important to us, our movement, because Sangha, when he spent 20 years in India, and he knew all about the untouchables. And he used to go on teaching tours, and he used to teach them. And there's a very famous ex-untouchable, we call them Dalits rather than ex-untouchables these days, called Dr. Ambedkar, who was a Dalit, but somebody sort of took an interest in him, and he managed to educate himself. Here's how a Dalit would educate themselves. They would have to stand outside the classroom and listen through the window at the teacher speaking. And this is what Ambedkar did, apparently. Anyway, he did very, very well. He was a very intelligent man, and he ended up going to London and studying here and in America, then going back, and he became India's first law minister when India became independent. So he's a really great hero for the untouchables. I notice in Manchester there's a new statue of Gandhi, Now that would not please the untouchables at all, because Ambedkar and Gandhi were very much opposing each other. They were enemies, really, because Gandhi upheld the caste system. Good man as he was in many ways, in that particular instance, that wasn't good at all, and the Dalits don't rate him at all. So I wasn't particularly happy to see Gandhi's statue near the cathedral in Manchester. I don't like that statue for that reason. And then Dr. Ambedkar he tried to change the society of India. He tried to get people to see that the caste system was bad and cruel and so on, but he couldn't get them to change. So he thought, we, the Dalits, we're going to have to leave the caste system somehow. We need to get out of here. And he looked into various ways of doing that. He thought, first of all, of Marxism, looked into that, and he thought, no, that's no good. It needs to be a religion. So he looked into Christianity, he looked into Sikhism, and he looked into Buddhism. And in the end, he thought Buddhism is the best one. So he converted to Buddhism, and then all his followers, there was this mass conversion to Buddhism in 1956. Millions of Indians moving from Hinduism and the caste system of Hinduism to beyond caste and becoming Buddhists. Wonderful, wonderful. And they became sons and daughters of the Buddha. And if you know anything about our movement at all, you'll know something about that. We work a lot with the Dalits, and there are many, many thousands, tens of thousands, I don't know how many thousands, maybe Shakijata might be able to tell us in the question and answers, but in fact, she should really be given this part of the talk. She'll know much more than me about it all. She's been going to India once a year and working with these people for many, many years now. So maybe she'll say something in the question and answers. That would be great. So, and Bhante got involved with this. He met Dr. Ambedkar, and they got on very well, and they were working together. And then Dr. Ambedkar died 6 weeks after the conversion. And Bhante Sangha actually did a lot of work with the Untouchables. Then I'm not going to talk about that right now. It would take me too far. What I want to talk about now, oh, actually, I do want to say a little bit. Just want to read you something. I was reading a transcript of one of Sangharaksh's talks today that he gave some time ago. Let me just find it for you. He says, I remember in the very early days of his life in India, 25 years ago. Now that was more like 45 years ago now, because the talk he gave then was a long time ago. I used to ask them individually. I used to ask men and women, even children, what difference has this conversion to Buddhism made for you? Do you feel different? And they all gave me the same answer, wherever I went, whenever I asked. They said that now we are Buddhist and we feel free, because they felt before bound by the caste system, weighed down by the caste system, enslaved by the caste system, enslaved by this concept of untouchability, but now they felt free. They were Buddhists, they were human beings. It's from a talk called The Ex-Untouchable Indian Buddhists, 1983. You'll find it on Free Buddhist Audio if you look there. So I just wanted to read that to you. But then there's the Buddha and caste. And what the Buddha said here, in what I've just read you, is when you become a member of my order, when you become a member of my Sangha, you leave caste behind. So in a way, by becoming a Buddhist, you join the outcasts. You don't have a caste when you're a Buddhist. You're outside of that system. That's what he was saying. And the Buddha was outspoken, an outspoken critic of the caste system. And if you look through the Pali Canon, there are many, many times when he meets a Brahmin, and the Brahmin is a believer in the caste system, and they have a discussion, and the Buddha just dismantles the whole thing and shows how ridiculous it is to think that you're born as a holy person, or you're born as a servant, And you can, and of course, the caste system, you can't move in it. I'm just reading the trilogy of novels by Hilary Mantel on Thomas Cromwell, and he began as a blacksmith's son, and he ended up running the country. You know, he's vice regent to Henry VIII. So it was very, very hard to do that, much harder than nowadays to move up through the ranks, but he did. Impossible in India in the caste system, because each caste has its dharma, its duty. And its duty is to do, if you're a servant, your duty is to be a servant, and all your family, and all your children for the rest, you know, children's children's children. That's your dharma, that's your duty. So there's no way out of it. And the Buddha was really, really critical of this. Lots of suttas where he does this. But I just want to read you one. We could go into a lot of them, but I just want to read you one. It's from the Dhammapada, and it's chapter 26. And he says, not because of matted hair, family, or birth is one a true Brahmin. In whom there is truth and Dhamma, that one is pure. That one is surely a Brahmin. Why do you have your hair matted, stupid one? And why your deer skin? Within you, there is a jungle. You only polish the outside. He could be pretty outspoken, couldn't he? Don't know who he was talking to there. You never know with the Dhammapada. He must have been talking to someone, but we don't know. So what the Buddha did, when he first started teaching, he tried to redefine Brahmin as he did there. A Brahmin isn't someone who's born into a certain caste. A Brahmin is someone who practices a spiritual life and has worked on themselves and is becoming spiritually different because of their own efforts. That's what a real Brahmin is. He tried to do that in the early stages of his career. The problem with doing that is you try to lift the word up and make it different, and the word tries to do the opposite. The word tries to bring you back down, and the meaning, what you mean by the word, becomes the old meaning. So it's a tricky thing to do. But for Buddha, being a Brahmin by birth was meaningless. You could only become a Brahmin, a true, wise, holy person, from your own efforts. So worth, not birth. So that's all I'm going to say about the caste system and the Buddha. Because I don't want to make the talk too long. As I said last week, I thought the talks were getting a bit too long, so I'm trying to keep them a bit short. What's the relevance to us of this particular wonderful quality? So that's what I'm going to talk about. So the caste system was, and to a certain extent it is, I think, the system in India. It's the way society was ordered. So you could say the caste system equals society. And you remember, well, you may remember, if you were there on my second talk of this series, I talked about those two qualities, solitude and aloof from society, or freedom, disentanglement from society. And this is kind of what's meant here. The caste system represents Indian society, and societies are groups. So this is Sangha's particular teaching, but his teaching about the group and the individual and the spiritual community, he didn't think it all up himself. He took his inspiration from a German philosopher called Karl Jaspers. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Someone will correct me later if I've got it right. She's going like this, the German person. That's good. So Karl Jaspers, he came up with this idea. He noticed that there was a certain age of humanity between 900 and 200 before Christian era, when something very remarkable happened in many parts of the world. And he called it the Axial Age. It's when something big happened. And I've got this book here by Karen Armstrong called The Great Transformation. Lovely book, very thick book. And she writes about this. She goes into it in great detail. The Great Transformation is the Axial Age. And I'm just going to read you a little bit about it. Axial Age. And she says, it was pivotal to the spiritual development of humanity. between 900 and 200 BCE in 4 distinct regions. The great world traditions that have continued to nourish humanity came into being. Confucianism and Taoism in China, Hinduism and Buddhism in India, monotheism in Israel, and philosophical rationalism in Greece. And then she mentions a number of people: Buddha, Socrates, Confucius, Jeremiah, the mystics of the Upanishads, Mencius, and Euripides. You said it was a period of intense creativity. Spiritual and philosophical geniuses pioneered an entirely new kind of human experience. So what was that human experience? It was one of individuality. It was one of realizing that I am not a member of a group. I am not a member of a tribe. I don't have to identify myself with any one particular peoples because I'm an individual. I stand alone. So individuality. This is where Sangha's teachings of individuality really come from. And I think it's important to know this because sometimes Sangha is criticised. He's criticised for loads of things, of course, but one of the things he's criticised for is teaching on the individuality. But it's absolutely essential, I think, because one of the things it does is it binds us. It makes it clear that Buddhism isn't the only religion. There's all these other religions that came from the Axial Age too, religions and philosophies. And it's important that we have a lot in common. There's a lot we don't have in common, but we have a lot in common too. So it connects us with the rest of the world, really. So, what this means is that people were beginning to emancipate from themselves from the group that they grew up in, and self-awareness was the big issue. This was the great spiritual experience that Karen Armstrong is talking about. Being aware of being aware of being. That's a quote from Nabokov. Being aware of being aware of being. You're not just aware, but you're aware that you are aware. And this is the kernel, this is the spark of all spiritual traditions, really. So, what's a group? I've been talking about the group. There are many different kinds of groups, of course, but basically a group is a bunch of people who you identify with as belonging to, and they feel that you belong to them too. So the first group we come into is the family. There's the family group, and then there's the national group. Perhaps between the family and the nation, there's your town. There's an interesting bit of research done in America a little while ago that most people think that their family is a bit above average, and the town they came from is a bit above average, and the school they went to is a bit above average, and the country they live in is a bit above average, and so on. This is group behavior. So nation, town, family, tribe, in a way. In a way, tribe is the big word for this. It's to do with tribalism. Political party. Politics is very tribal, isn't it? You've got the left and the right. Conservatives and Labour in this country, and the Liberal Democrats sort of moving around there. And you've got the extremes on both sides as well. Those are groups that you might belong to. Most people, it seems, in our movement seem to belong to the left. There aren't many right-wing people in our movement, not that I've come across anyway. I know a few. And of course, there's one right-wing person who's actually quite famous now, and it's Suella Braverman, who is a Tory MP. In fact, she's in the cabinet. She's our new Attorney General, and she's going for refuge mitra, mitra's of after ordination. And I know some of our left-wing people in our movement are horrified by this. What? How can a conservative politician practice the Dharma? Well, they can. Anyway, never mind. Let's move on from Suella Braverman and the Conservative Party. So the race is another group that you might identify with. Here's a trivial one, but it's very tribal. Football. Football fans are very, very tribal. I've got a very good friend whose name shall remain nameless, who shall remain nameless. He's a great Manchester United fan. And yesterday I was talking about the manager of Liverpool and saying what a good guy he was. And he was saying, yeah, he probably is, but he's Liverpool, I can't stand him. Anyway, that's tribalism. So the group, every society, every group has norms that you are supposed to follow. So you get this idea of towing the line. That is a group norm. And certain attitudes and even rules that you have to follow to be part of that group. And it's based on power. You know, to not toe the line means there's going to be a sanction of some kind. You have to follow the group norms and so on, otherwise you're cast out or you're punished in some way. The individual, so let's talk about the individual. The individual, an individual who's emancipated themselves from the group, they are first of all aware. As I said earlier, self-awareness is the key to individuality, and it's the key to spiritual development. As well as that, there's freedom from emotional dependence on the approval of the group. Yeah, because you know, if you stand outside of the group, if you go against it, they come down on you like a ton of bricks. So it's not minding that. So being brave enough to say, no, I don't want to do that, or I don't agree with that, and you know, taking the flak as a result of that, that means you need to be emotionally independent of the group. And another aspect of individuality is thinking for yourself, having your own thoughts, not just taking on the thoughts of other people in your group, and taking responsibility for yourself. This is one of the tragedies of group behavior, isn't it? That when you're in a group, individuals in that group, or statistical individuals, let's say, who are normally quite good people, they can do very nasty things in the name of the group, as we know when you look at history. So it's important, individuality is important from that point of view, because you become emancipated from the group. You begin to see for yourself rather than looking through the eyes of the group, and you take responsibility for your own actions. So it's really, really important stuff. Then there's a spiritual community. Is the spiritual community another group that you go into? The rivers, when they join the ocean, have they just joined another great big river? When the Buddhist disciples left the caste system, did they just join another kind of a caste? Well, the Sangha, the spiritual community, is supposed to be the free association of individuals. But of course, that's easier said than done, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So, moving on. There's a very interesting sutta called the Dasa Dhamma Sutta. You don't need to remember that or write it down, because it's going to be in the chat section later. You'll be able to see it later. Dasa means 10, and Dhamma in this instance means things. So the 10 things, and the Buddha gave it to his bhikkhu and bhikkhuni disciples. These are the 10 things that people who have gone forth from the group into the Sangha, the 10 things that you need to reflect on often. Some of you may know the 5 things that all Buddhists, whether they're man or woman, lay or ordained, need to reflect on often. Well, this is the 10 things that bhikkhus and bhikkhunis have to reflect on often. Well, I'm only going to tell you one of them, and it's the first one. First reflection: I have become casteless. That's the first reflection. You just reflect on that. And you might be thinking, how do you reflect on that? I'm casteless, yes. What do you do with that? Well, I think what this is telling us quite strongly, I'm getting really distracted by Abbas's screen there. Strange things happening. Anyway, come back to you. Yeah, what this is saying, the fact that the Buddha is saying you need to reflect on this often, what this means is that you might have left your caste to join the Sangha externally, but now there's the internal work to be done. Because we know from last week that someone might dress up as a monk and follow the monks and say, I'm a monk too, I'm a monk too. And they might look like a monk or a bhikkhu, but they aren't really one. And going back to this Dhammapada verse, not because of matted hair, family or birth, is one a true Brahmin. In other places in the Dhammapada, he says, not just because you got a shaved head and a robe makes you a bhikkhu. So the external is only one thing you do. Now you need to work on the internal. So why would you need to work on the internal aspect of castelessness? Because it's a difficult thing to do. It's very hard because conditioning goes very, very deep. And you might spend years and years emancipating yourself from the caste system. We know this, for instance, in what, unfortunately, I don't know where to look for it now. But I remember a couple of years ago, looking through the Pali Canon, I found a sutta where one of the bhikkhus, some of the other bhikkhus complained about this other bhikkhu. They went to the Buddha and said, look, this bhikkhu, he used to be a Brahmin, and he's still acting like one. He's telling us what to do and so on. And so the Buddha hauled him up and said, is that what you do? And he said, yeah. He said, well, stop doing that. You know, you're not a Brahmin anymore. So it's quite difficult to let go of your past conditioning. So they had to really work on this. So what's the relevance to us? The relevance to us is that when we start practicing the Dharma, when we join the spiritual community, we've left the old group loyalties behind, or we try to. So when we join the spiritual community, we're first and foremost, so that, I know exactly where I've got that phrase from. It comes from football. Footballers always say that. First and foremost, you know that, Marcus. First and foremost, sorry about that anyway. That's my conditioning, you see. It's very hard to let go of your conditioning. So, what was I saying? The relevance to us, yeah. So, when you join the spiritual community, you're trying to be an individual, and that is really hard, I can tell you. When I was a young man, I used to talk about individuality, and I just assumed I was one. You know, I thought, oh, I think for myself and so on. 20 years later, I realized how self-deluded I was, how very, very difficult it is to be an individual, to think your own thoughts, to stand up in your own thoughts, to not feel that you need other people's approval of you. It's very, very difficult. So we could say, okay, so let's change this, this reflection, make it for us. Okay, the reflection is, I am now an individual, not. Perhaps it would be better if the question was, am I an individual yet? Probably not. So then you can sort of look at what aspects of yourself are still clinging to the need to belong to one or other of the groups that you came from. So this is a lovely reflection to do and very challenging. And there are different kinds of reflections, of course. Some are analytical, some are imaginative. This kind of reflection is what in the ancient Greek philosophical tradition is called examination of conscience. It's a really good reflection, examination of conscience. So you just sit down or go for a walk or whatever and you think, so am I an individual? Or maybe a better question would be, to what extent am I now an individual? And to what extent am I needing approval from the groups that I belong to? Break that down a bit. Am I self-aware? Am I aware of myself as a being, a separate being? Maybe I am now because I'm reflecting, but just think about the last 24 hours. Have I been self-reflective all that time? Probably not. There's a bit to do there. I need to work on that quite a bit. Second one, you could say, am I emotionally dependent on the approval of others? Probably, yes. To what extent am I? Am I emotionally dependent on the approval of others? Yeah. Following on from that, do I really think for myself? You know, this is one of the important qualities of the individual, that they think for themselves. And what I've noticed is people often don't quite understand that characteristic. They think that thinking for yourself means having whatever thoughts you want to have. And usually the thoughts that we have aren't our own. They've come from somewhere else. And people think they're being really individual and can't think of the other word, when they're coming up with a thought which goes against the Dharma, or goes against what Sangha actually said, and they think I'm going to be individual, but it's just a thought from somebody else, another authority that they're bringing in. It's just two authorities banging up against each other. So, do I really think for myself? And then coming on from that, the opinions I hold, are they really mine? How have I come to them? Have I really looked into a topic? Do I really know what I'm talking about? Or have I just picked it up from the people around me? Because the people around you are probably all in a similar kind of group. It's interesting with Brexit, for instance. You probably most of the people you know voted for Remain. And you can't imagine who on earth could have voted to leave. They must be crazy, right-wing, stupid idiots. That's the way it often Remainers thought of Brexiteers. But I know a few Brexiteers, and I'm one myself. And so it was very difficult, wasn't it, when the referendum came. I'm sorry, people who from Germany and Spain and so on, but it was very difficult to know what to do. Well, you might have thought it was easy. I didn't think it was. I bought a book to try and figure it out, and even then I couldn't figure it out. But how much do we really know about what our opinions, where they come from? They usually come from, we just get them from the people around us. And we think they're ours, but they're not really. So that's a really big thing to do, and it's a really important reflection to have. Do I think for myself? Are my opinions really mine? When you do have your own opinion, when you come to your own opinion on something, and it's a bit against the norm, is there fear there? Are you frightened to have that opinion? Because if you mention it to people, they might come down on you. It's like, what? You fascist. That's the kind of thing that happens, isn't it? So are you courageous enough to state your own opinion, even though it might not be very popular? And here's a really frightening one. Before you even get to stating it, do you have enough courage to even think your own thoughts before you even get to the point of stating them? Because very often people don't think outside of the box because it's too frightening. So to really think, to really reflect on everything from scratch, where have I got this opinion from? Well, let's have another look at it and see. Let's really delve into it and see if this opinion is really worth having. And you might find it's not. And then you're in trouble because you're going against all your friends and so on. Are you willing to do that? Yes, that's enough, isn't it, on that? But that's what it means to be an individual, and that's what it means to really practice a spiritual life. And you may have noticed, I haven't mentioned this yet, but the Buddha here was only talking about the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. Only the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, those who leave home and into the homeless life, only those leave the caste system behind. And I wonder why that is. I'm not really quite sure, but it could be that it was unrealistic for a lay follower to leave the caste system. They probably weren't able to do that. But what they could do is, even if they couldn't leave it physically, externally, they could at least leave it internally. So, now we come on to the last part of the talk. And I've been talking about the individual, and I've mentioned some of the characteristics of the individual. But Sangha, although he talked a lot about these characteristics, he also said something really important, which is, okay, we talk about the characteristics of the individual, but you can't really pin an individual person down to characteristics. In the end, an individual is a mysterious thing. They're uncategorizationable. That's not the right word, is it? You can't categorize them. They're unfathomable is the word that Sangha mentioned. And a couple of years ago, I was reading The Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 Lines, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, translated by Edward Conser. And there's a very interesting bit here. It's headed The Infinitude of Perfect Wisdom, and it's a dialogue between a god, Chakra, and one of the Buddha's disciples, Subhuti. And Chakra starts talking about wisdom as being unlimited, measureless, infinite. And Subhuti said, yes, it is. And then he goes on to say, yeah, well, why is wisdom measureless, infinite, boundless, and so on? It's because the world is boundless. But not only the world, but things like this glass also is boundless, limitless. And why is that glass limitless? Because in the end, you can't find the beginning and end of it. That's just arbitrary. Yeah? We don't really need to know what that means right now, because I'm working up to something. He says, perfect wisdom is an infinite perfection because all objective facts are endless and boundless, and their beginning, middle, and end are not apprehended. And further, a being, right? A being is endless and boundless because one cannot get at its beginning, middle, or end. So now beings are endless, boundless. And then Chakra said, he asked the question, he says, are you saying that beings are infinite because there's loads of them, you know, an infinite number of them? And Subhuti says, no, that's not what I mean. What I'm saying is a being is infinite, right? Now, when I read that, I was really surprised and fascinated. And I thought, how can a being be infinite? What does that mean? Because I've got an edge here, you can see me, here I am, and I can see you. You don't seem very infinite somehow. But the end of another sutta, the Kevada Sutta from the Digha Nikaya, and again, the reference is going to be in the chat box. The Buddha ends by saying that enlightenment, the enlightened mind, he says, where consciousness is signless, consciousness is signless, boundless, and all humanous, right? Now, I looked that up, did a bit of work on it. Just hold on a minute. Here we are. Vijnana Anidasan. Vijnana, consciousness. Anidasan, Anidasanam, consciousness without feature, or a consciousness that is indefinable. Indefinable. Cannot be characterized. These are different translations. And then boundless is Anantam. There's an order member called Anantachitta, I think, meaning boundless, and therefore infinite consciousness. So enlightened mind is infinite. And then luminous all around. Sabbata Sabbatobam, universally brilliant, made up of Sabba, which is whole, entire, and Pabam, light, radiance, shining. So the enlightened mind is infinite, boundless, luminous, right? But that's the infinite mind. Now, this reminded me of a couple of lines in the Metta Sutta, which is a very simple sutta about doing the Metta Bhavana. But at some point, here's one translation, let him or her radiate boundless love towards the entire world, above, below, and across, unhindered. Another translation, so let him or her then, for every living thing, maintain unbounded consciousness in being. And let him too, with love for all the world, maintain unbounded consciousness in being. Another translation, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world. So this is the final stage of the metta bhavana, isn't this what you're doing? Your metta is going outwards. Now, what Sangha actually says is at that point, the metta bhavana can become a wisdom practice, yeah, a vipassana practice, because your consciousness is going out. Your consciousness, you're being aware of the infinity around you, boundlessness of beings. And if you really do that, then your consciousness becomes itself boundless, infinite. Great stuff. And, well, no, let's not close that yet. Yes, so I want to go back to the rivers. Let's go back to the rivers in the ocean. So there are these 5 great rivers going into the ocean, right? And it's all water, right? The rivers is water and the ocean's water. So they're all of one nature. But the rivers are bounded. They've got banks on either side, so they're bounded. And they're kind of told where to go in a way. You know, it's the path of least resistance, isn't it? The river meanders around depending on the countryside. It's not really free. It's free to flow, but it can't go wherever it wants. It's sort of funneled. But when it gets to the ocean, it's open and free. And you must imagine here the ocean represents infinity, right? So you've got that. So the nature of both is water. The nature of both is freedom. But there's a difference because river water is fresh water and the ocean water is salt water. And the 6th strange and wonderful thing about the ocean is that it tastes of salt. All over the ocean, tastes of salt. And the 6th strange and wonderful thing about the Dharma is just as the ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, the Dharma has one taste, the taste of freedom. So the rivers are not free. They're in their castes, or in our terms, they're conditioned. They're of the same nature as the ocean, but they're not free yet. It's only when they enter into the Sangha, into the Dharma and Sangha, that they become free, infinite consciousness. And I'm going to end. It's a pity there's no one from Sweden here this evening. Last week we had Peter and Maria from Stockholm, but they don't seem to be here. Let me just check that. Just check. No, they're not there. They're not here. Pity. Anyway, I'm going to read you a short poem by the great Swedish poet, Thomas Tranströmer. And it's translated by an order member, a Swedish order member called Prasadacharin. And the title of the poem is Roman Arches. And I'm going to read you this and then we'll finish. Inside the mighty Roman church, the tourists stood crowded in the half dark. Arch extended beyond arch, and no overview. A few candle flames flickered. An angel without a face embraced me and whispered through the entire body, "Do not be ashamed because you are human. Be proud." Inside you, arch behind arch opens infinitely. You will never be completed, and it is as it should be. I was blinded by tears. and led out into the sun-gazing piazza, together with Mr. and Mrs. Jones, Mr. Tanaka and Signora Sabatini, and inside them all, arch behind arch, opened infinitely.